The autumn rain drummed against the tall courthouse windows like impatient fingers seeking entrance. Officer sat in the third row of the gallery, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that he could feel the tension radiating down his neck. Beside him, Duke, his 4-year-old German Shepherd partner, rested his massive head on his paws, occasionally glancing up at his handler with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. The dog wore his official police vest, the badge gleaming under the fluorescent courtroom lights. Even Duke appeared to sense the gravity of the moment. The courtroom itself was a study in austere formality. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, worn smooth by decades of human emotion, tears, rage, relief, despair. The seal of Pennsylvania hung prominently behind Judge's elevated bench, a reminder that justice was not personal but institutional. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, furniture polish, and something else, something that had learned to recognize over his 15 years in law enforcement. It was the smell of consequence, of lives hanging in balance. Judge was 62 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and reading glasses suspended on a delicate chain. She had earned a reputation as fair but uncompromising, a judge who wouldn't tolerate procedural shortcuts or emotional manipulation. Respected her immensely. In a system that sometimes felt corrupted by politics and pressure, remained an anchor of legitimacy. She entered through the side door precisely at 9 o'clock, and the bailiff called the courtroom to order with a practiced authority that never failed to send a small thrill through chest. All rise. The Commonwealth versus Thomas Carver. Case number 2024 CV08847. Judge presiding. Thomas Carver sat at the defense table, exactly where had wanted him to be for 3 years. The man was 47, with thinning dark hair and the kind of face that seemed designed for deception. Smooth, unremarkable, entirely forgettable. He wore an expensive charcoal suit, clearly purchased specifically for trial, tailored perfectly to present an image of respectability. His lawyers flanked him on both sides. Michael, a sharp criminal defense attorney from Philadelphia, and Deborah, a junior associate who took meticulous notes on a laptop. Had spent more than 2 years studying Thomas Carver's life in obsessive detail. He knew the man's daily patterns better than he knew his own. He knew that Carver took his coffee black with 1 sugar at diner every Tuesday morning. He knew that Carver had a mistress in a condo on 5th Street. He knew about the offshore accounts, the coded text messages, the encrypted phone calls placed at precisely calculated intervals to avoid detection. Most importantly, knew that Thomas Carver was responsible for flooding their small Pennsylvania town with methamphetamine and prescription opioids, creating a cascade of destruction that had touched nearly every family in a 50-mile radius. Duke had played a crucial role in building this case. The dog's nose had sniffed out hidden compartments in abandoned warehouses where Carver stored product. Duke had alerted officers to a hidden stash beneath the floorboards of a property Carver owned. The canine had tracked Carver's scent through a forest when the suspect had attempted to flee questioning. Every alert had been documented and entered into evidence with pristine chain-of-custody documentation. Duke wasn't just a police dog. He was a truth-teller in a world full of lies. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney James, no relation to the judge, stood and began his opening statement. Was 41, lean, with an intensity in his eyes that reminded of a coiled spring. He had dedicated the last 4 months to this case, working late into the nights, reviewing evidence, coordinating with federal agents, and preparing witnesses. His voice carried the weight of genuine conviction as he outlined the case for the jury, 12 ordinary citizens who would decide if Thomas Carver would face the consequences of his actions. Ladies and of the jury, began, packing slowly before them. What you will see over the next week is a carefully constructed network of illegal drug distribution. You will see financial records that trace millions of dollars flowing through shell companies. You will see text messages, and recorded phone calls where the defendant explicitly discusses the sale and distribution of controlled substances. You will see testimony from law enforcement officers who have painstakingly investigated this operation. And you will see that Thomas Carver, the man sitting at that table, is the architect of this criminal enterprise. Felt a surge of satisfaction. Everything was describing was accurate. Everything had been documented with meticulous care. The financial records had been obtained through court-authorized subpoenas. The phone records had been secured through proper legal channels. The witness testimony would come from officers who had no personal agenda against Carver. They were simply presenting facts gathered through standard investigative procedures. What didn't know, as he sat in that courtroom with Duke beside him, was that embedded in this case, hidden like a poisoned seed in seemingly fertile soil, was a single compromised search warrant. It had seemed routine at the time, based on information from a confidential informant whose reliability had never been properly scrutinized. That warrant had led to the discovery of financial records that looked suspicious, which had prompted deeper investigation, which had led to the phone records and the text messages and everything else that now seemed so solid, so irrefutable. The morning sun broke through the clouds outside, and light streamed through the windows, illuminating dust particles that drifted like small clouds through the air. Watched as the jury absorbed Ada's words, their faces reflecting various levels of attention and concern. He could see it in their eyes. They wanted to believe the system worked, that justice was real, that a man like Thomas Carver could be stopped. Officer felt the weight of 2 years of investigation pressing down on his shoulders. He had devoted countless hours to this case, had missed his daughter's soccer games, had sacrificed time with his wife. He had believed with absolute certainty that Thomas Carver needed to be removed from society. He still believed it. The evidence was overwhelming. The case was airtight, or so it seemed. Duke shifted his position, resting his head more comfortably on leg. The dog's warmth provided a small comfort in the cold formality of the courtroom. Rubbed Duke's ears gently, a habit born from countless hours spent together. As he sat there, waiting for his turn to testify, waiting for the moment when he would present the evidence that would put Thomas Carver away, could not have imagined that the entire foundation of this prosecution was about to collapse, not because of any mistake he had made, but because of a small child's innocent recognition of a dog. The morning had progressed smoothly through the prosecution's opening statements and the first witness, a federal agent who about the financial patterns associated with drug trafficking operations. The courtroom had settled into a predictable rhythm, the kind that characterized most criminal trials. Questions answered, exhibits presented, objections raised and overruled. Officer had relaxed slightly, his initial anxiety giving way to cautious confidence. The case was unfolding exactly as the prosecution team had planned during their countless preparation sessions. It was 10:47 a.m. when the side door suddenly swung open. Sarah Carver, Thomas Carver's ex-wife, burst through the entrance with visible desperation etched across her face. She was 39 years old, with hair pulled into a messy bun and wearing dark jeans and a cardigan that suggested she had dressed hastily. In her arms, she carried a small child, a boy no more than 3 years old, with chestnut hair and the kind of restless energy that only toddlers seem to possess. His name was Junior, though most people called him MJ. He was Thomas Carver's grandson through his eldest son, a boy who had been born during one of his father's prison stints for a different crime entirely. Sarah had made a critical error that morning. She had arranged with her mother-in-law, Carver, who was supposed to watch Young while Sarah attended the trial. Sarah needed to be there to provide moral support to Thomas, or so she had told herself. The truth was more complicated. Sarah harbored deeply conflicted feelings about her ex-husband. She had divorced him 5 years ago when she could no longer ignore the obvious signs of his criminal activity, yet she still maintained a complicated relationship with him. She had before the grand jury that indicted him providing testimony that was damaging but factual. At 9:15 that morning, Carver had called Sarah in a panic. She had fallen on the stairs leading to her apartment, wrenched her ankle severely, and was unable to care for. Could Sarah find another solution? Sarah had frantically called 3 different babysitters, but none were available on such short notice. A professional facility would take hours to process paperwork. Desperate, Sarah had made a decision that she now deeply regretted. She had brought to the courthouse. The bailiff immediately stood, preparing to object to the presence of a child in the courtroom. Judge looked up from her bench, her expression shifting from judicial composure to something closer to confusion. The prosecutor, Ada James, turned in his seat, his eyes widening slightly. Thomas Carver's face showed a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or an attempt to convey concern for his grandson that might influence the jury. "Your Honor," Sarah said hurriedly, approaching the bench, "I'm so sorry for the disruption. I fell through. I didn't have any other options. My ex-husband's family member was supposed to watch him, but there was an emergency. I wouldn't have brought him if I had any alternative." Judge's expression softened slightly. She understood the realities of single parenthood and family emergencies. She had raised 2 children of her own while maintaining a legal career. "Sit in the back," she instructed, pointing to the rear gallery seats, "and if he becomes disruptive, he'll need to leave immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah replied, visibly relieved. She guided to the back row and settled him into a seat beside her. Was restless. He had been confined to a car seat for the 20-minute drive to the courthouse, and now he found himself in this strange, formal room filled with adults who spoke in hushed, serious tones. Everything about the environment was foreign and unsettling to a 3-year-old. He squirmed in his seat, whining softly. Sarah did her best to quiet him, offering him a juice box from her purse, a small coloring book she kept for emergencies, anything to keep him occupied. For approximately 20 minutes, Sarah's strategy worked. Colored, sipped his juice, and remained reasonably quiet. The trial continued. The federal agent finished his testimony. Ada called his next witness, a forensic accountant who began presenting complex financial charts and transaction records that documented the flow of money through various shell companies supposedly controlled by Thomas Carver. Then, at 11:03 a.m., something shifted in the courtroom's energy. Officer, who had been sitting with Duke beside him, adjusted his position slightly. Duke, responding to the slight movement, lifted his head and turned it toward the back of the courtroom, his ears perking up with interest. It was a completely ordinary movement, a dog responding to subtle cues from his handler. Nothing remarkable about it, nothing that would normally command any particular attention. But Junior noticed. The young boy's eyes locked onto Duke with the kind of singular focus that only small children seemed capable of. His coloring book fell forgotten to the floor. His entire body went rigid. Something in his memory, something buried in the recesses of his 3-year-old consciousness, suddenly activated. His small face transformed. Confusion gave way to recognition, which gave way to genuine excitement. "That's the dog," he shouted, his voice cutting through the courtroom with the kind of clarity that only innocent children could achieve. "That's the dog. That's the dog from Grandpa's house." The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The courtroom froze as though someone had pressed pause on reality itself. The forensic accountant's voice trailed off mid-sentence. Ada's pen stopped moving across his legal pad. Judge's reading glasses slipped slightly down her nose as she looked up from the bench. Attorney Michael, the defense counsel, leaned back in his chair as though physically struck. Officer felt his heart rate spike dangerously. His mouth went dry. Thomas Carver's face drained of color. All the carefully constructed composure, all the performative concern, all the strategy collapsed in a single instant. His eyes darted between his grandson and Officer, then to the dog, then back to his grandson. His jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his face visibly twitched. "What did he just say?" Judge asked, her judicial authority suddenly replaced with something closer to genuine confusion. Sarah, horrified, pulled against her side. "No, sweetheart, you're confused. Hush now, we need to be quiet." But with the insistence that only a young child could muster, pointed directly at Duke again. That dog came to Grandpa's house. I remember, that big dog, I petted it. I was scared, but then I petted it." "Your Honor, Officer began, but Judge silenced him with a raised hand. "The witness will remain silent," she commanded, her eyes narrowing as she processed the implications of what had just occurred. "Bailiff, remove the child from the courtroom immediately." The bailiff moved quickly, gently guiding Sarah and the now protesting toward the side exit. The boy continued to insist, his voice growing more agitated. "But that is the dog. I know that dog. Why is everyone being weird?" Within 30 seconds, the courtroom door closed behind them, muffling confused protests. The courtroom fell into a silence so profound it seemed to have physical weight. Judge stared at Officer with an expression that suggested she was suddenly seeing him, and the entire case, in a completely different light. "We're taking a recess," she announced coldly. 15 minutes, bailiff, secure the courtroom." As officers moved to comply, felt his entire world beginning to tilt on its axis. Duke whined softly, sensing his partner's sudden distress. In that single moment, articulated by an innocent child's memory, everything had changed. The 15-minute recess transformed instantly into something far more serious. Judge Chambers became the epicenter of a controlled explosion of legal maneuvering, procedural uncertainty, and mounting dread. The judge herself sat behind her mahogany desk, her composed exterior cracking just enough to reveal the sharp intelligence working frantically behind her eyes. She had been a judge for 23 years, had presided over hundreds of criminal cases, but she had never encountered something quite like this. "I want to know exactly what that child said and what it means," Judge commanded, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Bailiff, bring the child back in. We'll conduct a brief inquiry in chambers. Counsel for both sides will be present. This will be recorded." Ada James felt his stomach twist into knots. He had prepared meticulously for this trial, had reviewed every piece of evidence multiple times, had anticipated objections and prepared counterarguments. He had not prepared for this. Officer stood motionless, his face a mask of controlled panic. Duke, sensing his handler's distress, pressed against leg with concern. The detective's mind was racing through possibilities, rejecting each one as impossible. "This is outrageous," Michael, the defense attorney, declared, his sharp eyes gleaming with the predatory satisfaction of a lawyer who had just been handed an unexpected weapon. "Your Honor, that child's statement appears to contradict the foundation of this entire prosecution. Officer claims to have no contact with Mr. Carver's residence, yet the child, an impartial witness by any reasonable standard, clearly recalls a police dog at his grandfather's home." "Counsel, let's not jump to conclusions before we hear what the child actually has to say," Judge replied, though her tone suggested she was grasping at procedural straws. "Bailiff." The bailiff returned with Sarah Carver and Jr. within minutes. The child had been crying, confused by the sudden disruption and removal from the courtroom. His small face was blotchy, his eyes red-rimmed. Sarah looked, uncertain whether to apologize or defend herself. A court psychologist, doctor, was also present. She had been called from her office down the hallway. Judge Chambers suddenly felt impossibly crowded. The judge sat behind her desk. Officer and Ada stood to one side. Michael and Deborah occupied the other. Sarah and were seated in chairs positioned directly before the judge's desk. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenotype machine, recording every word. "Is it?" Judge asked gently, her judicial severity softening as she addressed the child. Her years of experience had taught her that even the bench could bend slightly when dealing with young children. "I'm Judge. I just need to ask you a few questions. Is that okay?" Junior nodded hesitantly, his thumb going into his mouth, a classic comfort gesture. "You said something about a dog," the judge continued carefully. "Can you tell me about that dog? Where did you see it?" The child's words tumbled out in that fragmented, stream of consciousness way that young children spoke. "At Grandpa's house. The big dog, it was brown and black. It was really big. I was scared. There were policemen, lots of people. They were looking at things. The dog came to me and I petted it. It was soft. I remember the dog." Doctor watched carefully, noting the consistency of his recollection, the specificity of his details. When children described memories accurately, certain markers emerged: sensory details, emotional reactions, logical sequences. The description contained all of these elements. "When was this?" Judge asked. "Do you remember?" "I don't know," replied with the honesty only a 3-year-old could provide. "It was before, a long time ago." "Did your grandfather talk about it?" Judge pressed gently. "No, nobody talked about it. I just remember. Because I was scared and then the dog was nice." Officer felt the room spinning slightly. His mouth had gone completely dry. His palms were sweating despite the cool temperature of the judge's chambers. In all his years as a police officer, he had never experienced this sensation. The feeling that the ground beneath him was shifting, that the case he had devoted 2 years to was beginning to crumble from within. "Thank you," Judge said. "You can go with your mother now." Sarah quickly ushered her confused son out of the chambers, apologizing profusely. Once they were gone, the door closed, and the atmosphere transformed entirely. The legal professionals suddenly seemed to occupy a completely different space, one filled with calculation, strategy, and dawning comprehension of what the child's testimony might mean. "Your Honor," Michael began immediately, "that child's account suggests a significant procedural issue. According to officers' testimony thus far, no DEA or police operation has occurred at my client's residence. Yet this child clearly recalls exactly such an operation, with specific details about police presence and a police canine. This raises serious questions about the foundation of this investigation." "One moment," Ada interjected. "Your Honor, a 3-year-old's memory is notoriously unreliable. He could be confusing this courtroom dog with any number of police dogs, conflating multiple memories, or repeating something he heard discussed." "But the specificity," Doctor spoke up from the corner where she had been observing. "The child described sensory details, the dog's appearance, his emotional reaction, the presence of multiple officers. That level of specificity in a 3-year-old's memory typically indicates an actual experience rather than imagination or conflation." Judge held up her hand, silencing further argument. "I need to review the investigative files. Specifically, I need to see if there was any law enforcement operation at Thomas Carver's residence that I'm not aware of. This trial is in recess until further notice. Bailiff, secure the defendant in holding. Counsel, I want copies of all search warrants, all surveillance documentation, and a timeline of all law enforcement operations related to this investigation delivered to my chambers within the hour." Officer felt something cold and terrible crystallizing in his chest. He knew, with sudden terrible clarity, what the judge was going to find. 6 months earlier, there had been a search warrant executed at a property associated with Thomas Carver. It had been based on information from a confidential informant. The search had yielded nothing. It had seemed like a routine dead end in an ongoing investigation. But if that search warrant had brought team to Carver's residence, if a drug detection dog had been present, if a young child had witnessed that operation, then the entire foundation of what came after needed to be examined. As stood in the judge's chambers, watching Ada's face pale as the same realization dawned on him, Officer understood that the morning's proceedings had marked a turning point. A child's innocent memory, a simple, truthful recollection, had just opened a door that should never have been closed in the first place. and on the other side of that door lay uncomfortable truths about how this investigation had actually proceeded. The courthouse basement archives resembled a tomb dedicated to bureaucratic permanence. Climate-controlled storage units housed thousands of case files, organized by year and case number. Officers stood among the stacks with Ada James, their faces illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lighting as they worked frantically through the documented history of the Carver investigation. Judge's deadline, 1 hour to produce all relevant documentation, had transformed what should have been a leisurely afternoon into a desperate race against time. Hands trembled slightly as he pulled file folders from the metal shelves. His mind was already 3 steps ahead, anticipating what they would find, dreading the confirmation of his growing suspicion. Next to him, Ada moved with mechanical precision, his earlier confidence replaced by something that resembled controlled panic. "Here," said suddenly, his voice tight. "September 14th, 2023. Search warrant application, case number 2023 SW04421. They spread the documents across a nearby table, photographs and papers spreading like evidence of a crime scene. The search warrant had been authorized by Judge Harold, a judge known for being relatively liberal in granting law enforcement requests. The probable cause statement was brief but seemingly sufficient. A confidential informant had reported suspicious activity at a property located at 847 Maple Street, the residence of Thomas Carver. The informant alleged that Carver was storing and distributing controlled substances from the residence. Officer chest tightened as he read the informant's name, Finch. He knew Finch. Finch was a small-time criminal with a history of drug charges, a man with every incentive to cooperate with law enforcement in exchange for leniency, but had never personally worked with Finch on this investigation. The search warrant had been pursued by a different unit, the DEA working in coordination with local police. The search was executed, noted, reading further, on September 15, 2023. The results are here. He flipped to another document. No contraband was recovered, no drug paraphernalia, no controlled substances. The property was cleared of any criminal activity. The implications hung between them like a toxic gas. If no drugs had been found, if the search had yielded nothing incriminating, then why had the investigation continued? Why had officer pursued additional leads? Why had the case proceeded to prosecution? Pulled up the next document, a supplemental report dated 2 weeks after the search warrant. His own signature was on it. He had documented suspicious financial transactions associated with Carver's accounts. He had noted the phone records that showed regular communication patterns consistent with drug distribution networks. He had compiled witness statements from individuals who claimed to have purchased substances from Carver. But all of those investigative steps had occurred after the failed search warrant. They had been conducted with the knowledge that law enforcement had already searched Carver's residence. They had been launched from the foundation of that initial operation. "Jesus," whispered, running his hand through his hair, "it's all downstream from this search warrant." "Not necessarily," said, though even as he spoke the words he knew they were hollow. "The other evidence is independent. The financial transactions are real. The witness statements were corroborated." "But would you have pursued those leads if the search warrant hadn't been executed?" Challenged, his eyes meeting, with a mixture of accusation and desperation. "Would you have known to look for those transactions? Would you have identified those witnesses?" Didn't answer. They both knew the truth. The search warrant had been the catalyst, the initial piece of probable cause that had launched everything that followed. Without it, the investigation might never have progressed beyond Finch's unverified tip. Phone rang. It was Captain Lisa from the police department calling from the station. "Judge wants a complete timeline of the Carver investigation," Captain said without preamble. "Everything from initial contact to the present. I need it in writing, authorized by you personally." She's asking specific questions about how we identified Carver as a subject in the first place. Captain, I began, then stopped. He glanced at Ada, who was watching him intently. I'll have it to you within the hour. He ended the call and turned back to the documents. Pulling up his original case file, began reconstructing the timeline from memory and documentation. The investigation had begun when Finch approached a DEA undercover agent claiming to have information about a major drug operation. Finch had provided Carver's name, his address, descriptions of the operation, all unverified information that had nonetheless been sufficient to justify a search warrant application. Who authorized the search warrant request? Asked, already flipping through pages looking for the answer. Special agent from the DEA, replied. He's been reassigned to the federal building in Pittsburgh. Immediately began dialing. I need to speak with special agent, he told whoever answered at the DEA office. It's regarding the search warrant executed on September 15, 2023, on Maple Street in our jurisdiction. Yes, I'll hold. While they waited, pulled up more documentation. The search warrant had been executed by a team of 4 officers and 2 DEA agents. They had spent 90 minutes at the residence. They had used a drug detection dog, a German shepherd named Not Duke. The dog had alerted to something in the garage, prompting a more thorough search, but ultimately no drugs were found. The alert had been a false positive, which happened occasionally with detection dogs. But a young child had been present during that search. He had seen the dog. He had remembered it. Special agent came on the line and explained the situation briefly. Could hear the agent's voice through the phone speaker, initially defensive, gradually becoming more cautious as the implications became clear. The informant was reliable, insisted. Finch had provided good information in the past. Had he pressed, "Can you verify that?" There was a long pause. I'd need to review his prior reports, but the search warrant was approved by the judge. Everything was done properly. After they ended the call and stood in the basement archives in heavy silence, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air felt too thin, too cold. We need to look at Finch's entire history, finally said. If his information was actually unreliable, if he provided false or misleading intelligence, then the entire foundation crumbles. Nodded slowly. He understood what they were facing now. This wasn't just about the child's testimony anymore. This was about the fundamental integrity of the investigation. If Finch had lied, if he had provided false information motivated by personal grievance rather than genuine knowledge, then the search warrant was baseless. And if the search warrant was baseless, then every piece of evidence that flowed from it became legally questionable. The case against Thomas Carver, which had seemed so solid just hours ago, was beginning to develop fractures. And the officer who had built it so carefully was beginning to understand that he might have built it on sand. Finch lived in a cramped apartment on Riverside Avenue in a neighborhood that time had forgotten. The building's exterior was deteriorating, paint peeling in long strips, windows patched with duct tape, the front door hanging slightly askew on broken hinges. Officer stood outside the building on a gray afternoon, holding a folder containing Finch's complete history with law enforcement. What he was about to discover would shatter the remaining foundations of the Carver case. Ada James stood beside him, his jaw clenched with the kind of tension that suggested he was beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what they were uncovering. Behind them, 2 additional officers waited for authorization to enter the apartment. Judge had granted them a search warrant for Finch's residence based on petition. The judge had recognized, with the sharp intuition of someone with 2 decades of judicial experience, that Finch's credibility needed to be thoroughly examined. "Ready?" asked, though his voice suggested he was asking himself as much as. Nodded, and they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. The apartment smelled of stale cigarettes and unwashed dishes. Finch wasn't home. He was currently employed at a warehouse on the city's industrial outskirts, a job he'd maintained sporadically over the past 5 years. Officers had already coordinated his temporary detention based on the search warrant authorization. What they found in Finch's apartment told a story that Judge Shrewd Judgment had somehow already sensed. In a shoebox under the bed, buried beneath old photographs and receipts, discovered a collection of documents that revealed the true history between Finch and Thomas Carver. There were handwritten letters, never sent, filled with rage and resentment. There were printouts of emails, bank transfer records, and what appeared to be legal documents related to a failed business venture from 7 years prior. "Look at this," said, his voice hollow. He held up a letter dated 2017. The handwriting was aggressive, the words underlined repeatedly for emphasis. "You promised me $50,000 for the restaurant venture. You said you believed in my business plan. Then you backed out without explanation. You destroyed my dream. You ruined my life. You destroyed my reputation when you told people the business plan was worthless. I will never forget this betrayal. I will make you pay. Someday, you will understand what it feels like to lose everything because of someone you trusted." The letter was signed D. Finch, but never delivered to Carver. Felt something twist inside his chest. His mind raced backward through the investigation, recontextualizing every interaction with Finch. The informant had always seemed eager to provide information, almost too eager. He had been exceptionally detailed in his descriptions of Carver's operation. The specificity of his allegations had impressed at the time. It had all been orchestrated. It had all been revenge. Further investigation of Finch's apartment revealed even more damning evidence. There were photographs of Thomas Carver taken over several months. Finch had been conducting his own surveillance. There were notes documenting Carver's movements, his associates, his daily routines. But none of these observations provided any actual evidence of drug trafficking. Instead, what emerged was a portrait of obsessive hatred, of a man consumed by his desire to destroy someone who had wronged him years earlier. "He fabricated it," said quietly, sitting on the edge of Finch's bed, holding the collection of evidence. He created a narrative that was plausible enough to convince law enforcement to investigate Carver. He provided enough detail to seem credible, but it was all lies motivated by a personal vendetta. Walked to the apartment's small window and looked out at the street below. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the urban landscape. His entire career suddenly felt shadowed by doubt. He had been trained to evaluate informant credibility, to distinguish between reliable sources and unreliable ones. He had failed that test spectacularly. "The search warrant application," said slowly. "It stated that Finch had provided reliable information in the past. Did he?" Was already pulling up records on his laptop. The answer emerged within minutes. Finch had provided information leading to 2 arrests in 2019 and 1 in 2020. However, reviewing those cases more carefully revealed a troubling pattern. In each instance, the information had been accurate, but it concerned individuals with whom Finch had personal conflicts. A former employer he blamed for firing him, a neighbor with whom he'd had a property dispute, a romantic rival. "He's been using law enforcement as a tool for personal vengeance," said, his voice carrying the weight of dawning horror. "For years, and nobody caught it." By evening, officers had located Finch at the warehouse. When confronted with the evidence discovered in his apartment, Finch initially maintained his innocence. Then, gradually, his composure crumbled. In an interrogation room with and present, Finch finally confessed. "Thomas Carver destroyed my life," Finch declared, his voice carrying the bitter intensity of someone who had nursed a grudge for nearly a decade. "He promised me investment capital for my restaurant venture. He said he believed in my business plan. Then the offer without explanation. Do you know what that did to me? I had already signed the lease. I had already purchased equipment. I lost everything." Carver told mutual associates that my business plan was fundamentally flawed, that I was a fool for thinking it could succeed. That reputation followed me. I couldn't get financing from anyone else. My marriage fell apart because of the financial stress. My ex-wife blamed me for ruining our future. So you decided to frame him? Asked coldly. I decided he deserved to experience the same loss, Finch replied. I researched his operation. I knew he was involved in something illegal, not necessarily drugs, but something. I provided information to the DEA that seemed credible. I knew they would investigate. I knew they would find evidence if they looked hard enough. And they did, didn't they? They found nothing at your tip, said. The search warrant at his residence yielded zero evidence of drug trafficking. Finch's expression shifted into something resembling satisfaction. But it opened the door. Once you searched his property, you started looking more carefully. You found other evidence. You built a case. That's what I wanted, for you to investigate him so thoroughly that something would emerge. And it did. You contaminated the entire investigation, said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. You inserted yourself into a prosecution with no basis in actual criminal knowledge. You used personal vendetta to motivate a law enforcement operation. In the days that followed, investigators conducted a comprehensive re-examination of Finch's prior informant work. What emerged was a pattern of deliberate manipulation. Each time Finch had provided information, the target had been someone with whom he'd had a personal conflict. The arrests that resulted were real. The individuals had likely committed crimes, but Finch's motivation had never been public safety. It had always been personal revenge. By the time Judge reconvened court to address the implications of these discoveries, the prosecution's case had fundamentally shifted. The search warrant that had launched the entire investigation was now legally and ethically compromised. It had been based on false pretenses, motivated by personal vendetta rather than genuine criminal intelligence. Every piece of evidence that flowed from that search warrant, the financial records, the phone documentation, the witness leads, all of it now existed in a shadow of legal doubt. Officer sat in the courthouse that afternoon, Duke beside him, and watched as the foundation of 2 years of work crumbled into dust. He had believed he was pursuing justice. He had discovered instead that he had been manipulated by a man consumed by hatred, that his investigation had been corrupted by lies from its very inception. The worst part wasn't that Thomas Carver might escape prosecution. The worst part was that now had to confront the possibility that he had allowed his zeal for the case to blind him to these fundamental procedural failings. And he had no one to blame but himself. The courtroom had transformed into illegal. 2 weeks had passed since Finch's confession, 2 weeks during which Judge had scheduled an extensive evidentiary hearing to determine the fate of the Carver case. The hearing room was packed, not with the general public, but with legal professionals from across the state who recognized the significance of what was about to unfold. Cases involving compromised informants and tainted search warrants set precedents that reverberated through the entire criminal justice system. Judge sat elevated behind her bench, reading glasses perched on her nose, reviewing documents with the meticulous attention that had made her one of the most respected jurists in the state. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes contained a cold intelligence that suggested she was evaluating not just the legal arguments, but the character of everyone involved in the prosecution. Michael, the defense attorney, stood before the judge with the confidence of a man holding a winning hand. His opening statement was surgical in its precision. Your Honor, the foundation of this entire prosecution is fatally compromised. The search warrant that initiated this investigation was based on false pretenses provided by an informant motivated by personal vendetta rather than legitimate criminal intelligence. Finch fabricated his allegations against Thomas Carver as an act of revenge for a business dispute that occurred 7 years ago. This is not merely a procedural irregularity. This is a fundamental violation of due process. Every piece of evidence obtained after that initial search warrant is fruit of the poisonous tree. The entire prosecution must be dismissed. Ada James rose to respond. His face had aged considerably over the past 2 weeks, the stress of the cases unraveling evident in the deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He moved to the podium with the mechanical precision of a man who had rehearsed this argument countless times. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the irregularities regarding the informant's credibility, the prosecution's case does not rest solely on evidence derived from the search warrant. We have independent evidence, phone records obtained through proper legal channels, financial transactions documented through bank subpoenas, and testimony from witnesses who can attest to Mr. Carver's involvement in drug distribution based on their own personal knowledge. Yes, the search warrant's foundation was compromised. But the subsequent investigation uncovered corroborating evidence that stands independently. Judge raised her hand. Mister, can you honestly tell this court that you would have pursued those phone records and financial transactions without the initial search warrant? Can you establish that those investigation steps would have occurred absent the contaminated search warrant? There was a long pause. Ada's jaw tightened. Your Honor, it's difficult to establish a counterfactual with absolute certainty. However, that's not an answer, Judge interrupted. That's an evasion. Let's establish the factual record. Officer, I'd like you to address the court regarding your investigative priorities prior to and following the search warrant execution. Officer rose from where he had been sitting in the gallery. His legs felt unsteady as he made his way to the witness stand. He had been sworn in earlier, and now he sat under the intense gaze of the judge, the attorneys, and a courtroom full of legal professionals who were watching his testimony with the intensity of hawks observing potential prey. Officer, Judge began, prior to September 14, 2023, the date the search warrant was applied for, had you received any information suggesting that Thomas Carver was involved in drug trafficking? Took a breath. The truth felt like poison in his mouth. No, Your Honor. Finch's information was the catalyst that directed our investigation toward Mr. Carver. And had you independently identified any of the witnesses who subsequently to Mr. Carver's involvement in drug distribution? No, Your Honor. The investigation into Mr. Carver's associates began after the search warrant was executed. So, Judge stated, her voice carrying the weight of a verdict already delivered, the search warrant was the necessary predicate for the entire subsequent investigation. Without it, Mr. Carver would not have been on your radar. The financial transactions you examined would not have been scrutinized. The witnesses you interviewed would not have been contacted. Is that accurate? Voice was barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. Over the following 4 days, additional testimony revealed the depth of the prosecution's procedural failings. Special agent from the DEA that he had not conducted an adequate background investigation of Finch's credibility. He acknowledged that Finch's prior information, while seemingly accurate, had consistently targeted individuals with whom Finch had personal conflicts. This pattern should have triggered red flags, but it hadn't. Judge called for a break and reconvened the following Monday with a document she had prepared personally. A comprehensive analysis of the legal implications of using information from a compromised informant as the foundation for a search warrant. The law is clear, she stated from the bench, her voice resonating with judicial authority. The Fourth Amendment requires that search warrants be based on probable cause. That probable cause cannot be established through false or misleading information. When an informant deliberately provides false information motivated by personal vendetta, the entire legal foundation crumbles. Moreover, the doctrine of fruit of the poisonous tree dictates that evidence derived from an unlawful search cannot be used in prosecution. She paused, removing her glasses and rubbing her eyes, a gesture that revealed her exhaustion. However, the question before this court is whether evidence obtained after the search warrant can be considered sufficiently independent to survive the taint. The prosecution argues that subsequent investigation yielded independent evidence. I find this argument unconvincing. Judge then delivered what amounted to a rebuke of the prosecution's entire methodology. Officer conducted subsequent investigation with the knowledge that law enforcement had already searched Mr. Carver's residence. This knowledge, this implicit authorization from the state to investigate further, colored every subsequent investigative decision. The witnesses were identified through investigation that began after the search warrant. The financial transactions were scrutinized in the context of a man already suspected of criminal activity based on the search warrant. The entire investigative architecture was built on the foundation of the tainted search warrant. She turned to face Ada directly. The prosecution had an obligation to ensure that the informant's information was reliable. This obligation was not met. The prosecution had an obligation to investigate the informant's background and motivation. This obligation was not met. As a result, your entire case, despite the genuine criminal conduct of law enforcement officers trying to do their jobs, is fundamentally compromised. Judge's ruling came on a Friday afternoon. She suppressed all evidence obtained as a result of the search warrant executed on September 15, 2023. This ruling eliminated the phone records, the financial transaction documentation, and the primary witness leads. Without this evidence, the prosecution's case collapsed like a structure with its foundation removed. Officer sat in the gallery, Duke beside him, and felt the weight of professional failure settling over him like a heavy coat. He had spent 2 years building this case. He had believed in its righteousness. He had failed to recognize that he had been manipulated from the beginning. Ada looked devastated, his face a study in controlled anguish. The prosecution had, through no intentional wrongdoing of their own, constructed a case on lies. The legal system had correctly identified and rejected those lies, but the cost was evident in the prosecutor's expression. Judge concluded her ruling with a statement that would echo through law enforcement agencies across the state. This case represents a failure at multiple levels of our justice system. It demonstrates the critical importance of rigorous verification of informant reliability, of maintaining strict procedural adherence, and of recognizing that zeal for prosecution cannot be allowed to overcome the fundamental requirements of justice. The charges against Thomas Carver are dismissed with prejudice. This court will be issuing a formal written opinion regarding these proceedings, and I would expect that opinion to inform future law enforcement and prosecutorial practice. As Judge descended from the bench, Officer understood that the battle over Thomas Carver was lost. The true reckoning, the one that would determine the professional futures of everyone involved, was just beginning. The prosecution's offices occupied the entire 3rd floor of the courthouse annex, a sprawling collection of cubicles, conference rooms, and private offices where 37 attorneys worked on behalf of the Commonwealth. Ada James sat in his office, the door closed, staring at the blank wall before him. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city stretching toward the horizon, but wasn't seeing any of it. His mind was trapped in the legal reality that Judge's ruling had created. The suppression of evidence had devastated the prosecution's case. Without the phone records, without the financial documentation, without the primary witnesses identified through the contaminated search warrant, had virtually nothing. The case that had consumed 4 months of his professional life, that had seemed so airtight just 2 weeks ago, had evaporated like morning mist under the heat of judicial scrutiny. His phone rang. It was State Police Captain Lisa. "How bad?" Captain asked without preamble. "Worse than bad," replied. "We can't make the case proceed to trial. A jury would expect the evidence Judge suppressed. Without it, the conviction rate drops to essentially 0. I've run the numbers. We have nothing that would hold up under cross-examination." There was a long silence on the line. What about appealing the suppression ruling? "We could," said, "but Judge's legal analysis is airtight. Any appellate court would uphold her decision. We'd be filing an appeal we know we can't win, wasting resources and time while delaying resolution. Captain Sy carried the weight of professional disappointment. I need to brief the police commissioner. This is going to be difficult. Over the next 72 hours, Ada met with representatives from law enforcement, with the district attorney's office leadership, and with victims' advocates, families who had been devastated by the drug epidemic that Thomas Carver had allegedly fueled. The meetings were painful. They were exhausting. They were necessary. The victim's advocate, Maria Santos, sat across from with a file containing photographs of individuals whose lives had been destroyed by methamphetamine addiction. There was a 22-year-old woman who had overdosed in 2022, a 40-year-old man who had lost custody of his 3 children, a teenager who had spent 3 years in prison following a felony conviction related to drug possession. You're telling me that Carver might not face prosecution? Maria's voice carried the controlled fury of someone who had spent years fighting for people society had abandoned. I'm telling you that our case has been compromised, replied carefully. The evidence we would have relied on at trial has been suppressed due to procedural violations in how the investigation began. Without that evidence, conviction is unlikely. So he walks free? Maria asked. After poisoning an entire community, he just walks free? Not necessarily, said. We're exploring other options. What those options amounted to was a reality found almost unbearable. He could offer Thomas Carver a plea agreement, significantly reduce charges in exchange for guilty pleas and a shorter sentence. It was the legal equivalent of settling for half a loaf. It was compromise dressed up as justice. The plea negotiations were conducted over 2 days. Michael, Carver's defense attorney, came to the prosecution's offices with Carver himself. The defendant was noticeably more relaxed than he had been during trial preparation. He knew his position had improved dramatically. He knew that without the suppressed evidence, the Commonwealth had virtually no case. We'll accept guilty pleas on money laundering and conspiracy to distribute, offered. Federal sentencing guidelines would suggest 12 to 18 months. Given the circumstances, I'd request 5 years with eligibility for parole after 3. Michael smiled, an expression of predatory satisfaction. Your Honor would reject that sentencing recommendation given how weak your case has become. We're thinking 18 months total, with parole eligibility after 9 months. That's absurd, responded. The man operated a major distribution network. According to evidence that judge found fundamentally compromised, interrupted. You have nothing solid. We both know it. You're offering this plea because you have no choice. We're accepting nothing less than a sentence that reflects your evidentiary weakness. The negotiation was brutal and ultimately one-sided. The Commonwealth, having lost its foundation, could not dictate terms. Thomas Carver's superior legal representation, paid for by money the prosecution believed had been earned through drug trafficking, had secured him an extraordinarily favorable position. The final agreement guilty pleas to money laundering and conspiracy to distribute a controlled substance. The conspiracy charge acknowledged distribution, but without specifying quantity or the actual details of drug trafficking. The sentence was set at 4 years with parole eligibility after 18 months. For a man who the prosecution had spent 2 years investigating and prosecuting, it was extraordinarily lenient. Officer sat in the gallery when Carver appeared for his formal plea entry. The detective felt physically ill. Duke, sensing his handler's emotional distress, pressed against leg with concern. Hand moved automatically to the dog's neck, drawing comfort from the animal's presence. Judge accepted Carver's pleas with a neutrality that masked her own evident discomfort. Mr. Carver, you understand that by entering these guilty pleas, you're waiving your right to trial and accepting criminal responsibility for these charges. I do, Your Honor, Carver replied, his voice steady. He seemed almost amused by the proceedings. You understand that you're sentenced to 4 years in the custody of the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, with parole eligibility after 18 months.
I do, Your Honor.
Very well. This court accepts your pleas and imposes the sentence as negotiated. You will remain in custody pending transfer to your designated facility. The proceeding lasted less than 10 minutes. A man whom officer believed had devastated an entire community with drug distribution was led away with a sentence that many non-violent offenders received for first-time felonies. The legal system had worked. It had identified and corrected procedural violations, but the outcome felt like defeat. After the hearing concluded, remained in the gallery long after everyone else had departed. Maria Santos, the victim's advocate, sat beside him in heavy silence. 4 years, she finally said, after everything. It's better than acquittal, replied, though his voice carried no conviction. At least he admitted guilt. At least there's some accountability. Is there? Maria asked. He'll serve less than 2 years realistically. He'll have time served counted toward his sentence. He'll be eligible for work release programs. By the time his 3-year-old grandson is old enough to attend kindergarten, Thomas Carver will likely be free again. Had no response to that. The truth was undeniable. The legal system had protected Carver's constitutional rights by suppressing tainted evidence. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to work. But the result was a man who believed had caused immense harm receiving a sentence that seemed wildly inadequate. That evening, officer sat in his home with Duke beside him. His wife had left dinner in the refrigerator. He hadn't wanted to eat with the family. His daughter's soccer team had won their playoff game that afternoon, and he had missed it. He had been consumed by this case, by the investigation, by the prosecution. He had sacrificed his family's time for a case that had ended in compromise. Pulled up Finch's photograph on his laptop. Finch was now facing charges of perjury and filing false reports, but Finch's trial was months away. Finch's consequences were still uncertain. Meanwhile, Thomas Carver, whom still believed was guilty of major crimes, would serve less than 2 years in prison for those crimes. Justice, understood now, was not always about righteousness. Sometimes it was about procedure, about rules, about acknowledging that the system's integrity mattered even when that integrity prevented the outcome you believed was correct. And sometimes, that understanding was the most bitter pill of all. 6 months had passed since Thomas Carver entered the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections facility in. Judge sat in her chambers reviewing the comprehensive written opinion she had prepared regarding the case. The document was 47 pages long, meticulously researched, legally rigorous, and damning in its assessment of systemic failures that had nearly resulted in a conviction based on fabricated evidence. The opinion, filed as Commonwealth v. Carver, 2024 PA Super 847, had been circulated among law enforcement academies, prosecutor training programs, and appellate courts throughout the state. Legal scholars were already citing it in discussions about informant credibility and the necessity of rigorous verification procedures. Judge's clear articulation of the procedural failures had transformed what seemed like a local case into a precedent that would influence legal practice for years to come. Officer received a bound copy of the opinion in the mail, sent by Judge herself with a personal note attached. Officer, your integrity during this process, your willingness to testify honestly about your investigative methodology, and your acceptance of the consequences of systemic failures demonstrated the kind of character that law enforcement desperately needs. I hope this opinion contributes to preventing similar situations in the future. Respectfully, Judge. Read the opinion during his lunch break at the police station, sitting in his car with Duke beside him. The judge's analysis of his investigative decisions was neither harsh nor exonerating. She had documented, with surgical precision, the ways his zeal for prosecution had blinded him to procedural vulnerabilities. She had outlined the critical importance of investigating informant credibility before pursuing search warrants based on unverified information. She had emphasized that the most dangerous threat to justice was not crime itself, but the erosion of procedural safeguards designed to ensure that only the guilty were punished. One passage in particular struck deeply. Officer conducted his investigation with genuine dedication and apparent belief in the righteousness of his cause. This case demonstrates that dedication and righteous belief, while essential to effective law enforcement, are insufficient. The Constitution exists not to protect guilty individuals from justified prosecution, but to protect all individuals from unjustified prosecution. When law enforcement becomes so committed to a particular outcome that procedural safeguards are overlooked, the system's integrity is compromised. Officer investigation failed not because he was corrupt or malicious, but because he allowed his conviction in the righteousness of his cause to override his obligation to verify the foundation of his investigation. Over the next several months, the ripple effects of the Carver case became increasingly evident. The Pennsylvania State Police issued new regulations requiring that all informant information be independently before search warrants were pursued. The DEA, in consultation with federal prosecutors, implemented new protocols for evaluating confidential informant credibility. Law enforcement training programs throughout the state began incorporating the Carver case as a cautionary example. Finch's trial occurred in November, 9 months after his apartment search. The proceedings were straightforward. Finch had already confessed to fabricating information. His 7-year grudge against Thomas Carver was well documented. He was convicted of filing false reports and perjury, sentenced to 2 years in prison, slightly less than the reduced sentence Carver had received for the crimes that Finch had motivated investigators to pursue. The injustice of that comparison was not lost on Officer. Officer himself underwent mandatory retraining. He was assigned to work with the department's newly established Informant Credibility Task Force, a position created specifically to prevent future cases from becoming contaminated by false or unreliable information. The irony was bitter. He was now responsible for preventing the kind of mistake he had made. Yet the work proved meaningful. Discovered that across the department's case files, there were numerous investigations that had been initiated based on informant information without adequate verification. Some of those investigations had proceeded to prosecution. Some had resulted in convictions. It was impossible to know, without comprehensive review, how many cases might have been built on foundations as compromised as the Carver case. Captain Lisa called into her office on a cold December afternoon. She was retiring, a decision made partially in response to the Carver case's professional and political fallout. "The department is creating a new position," Captain explained. "Detective supervisor specializing in investigation integrity. It's a promotion with significant authority to review cases and recommend procedural changes. I'd like you to consider applying." Felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The position represented both an acknowledgement of his professional capabilities and a recognition that he had learned profoundly from failure. He accepted the promotion. Officer's next significant professional action was to establish a mentorship program pairing experienced investigators with newer officers. The program emphasized the importance of verifying information, of distinguishing between zeal and justice, of recognizing that procedural integrity was not an obstacle to justice, but its foundation. One of mentees was a young detective named Sarah Martinez. During one of their sessions, Martinez asked directly, "Don't you think the system failed? You did everything right from your perspective. You followed proper procedures, but the case still collapsed." "I didn't do everything right," replied. "I accepted informant information without adequate verification. I allowed my belief in the case's righteousness to override my obligation to scrutinize the foundation. That wasn't the system failing. That was me failing to follow the system's requirements." He paused, rubbing Duke's ears, a gesture that had become habitual. The system actually worked exactly as it was designed to work. Judge identified the problem. She corrected it. Thomas Carver faced reduced consequences not because the system failed, but because I failed to maintain the system's integrity. Meanwhile, the 3-year-old boy who had sparked the entire chain of events, little Junior, continued his childhood unaware of his impact. Sarah Carver, his mother, struggled with the reality that her innocent attempt to manage a crisis had exposed foundational problems in the prosecution of her ex-husband. She had provided testimony that contributed to his prosecution. Then her son's observation had compromised that prosecution. Thomas Carver served 18 months in prison before being paroled in June 2025. Upon release, he maintained a low profile, living in a different state, his criminal enterprise disrupted, his reputation destroyed. Officer never learned whether Carver was actually the major drug trafficker the investigation had suggested, or whether he had been primarily engaged in money laundering and smaller-scale distribution. That uncertainty, the inability to definitively know the extent of Carver's guilt, haunted. Judge written opinion had become required reading in law enforcement academies throughout Pennsylvania and several neighboring states. Her analysis of the case had generated law review articles, contributed to changes in federal sentencing guidelines, and influenced how prosecutors nationwide evaluated informant reliability. On the 1-year anniversary of the child's courtroom observation, Officer visited Judge in her chambers. They sat across from each other in a context entirely removed from the adversarial environment of trial. "I wanted to thank you," said. "Your opinion, your clarity about what happened, it helped me understand where I failed. More importantly, it's helping other investigators avoid making similar mistakes." Judge removed her reading glasses and rubbed her eyes. "This case taught me something important as well, officer. The difference between a just system and an unjust one isn't measured by conviction rates or prosecution success. It's measured by whether the system has mechanisms to identify and correct its own errors. Your willingness to acknowledge your procedural failures, to accept the consequences of those failures, and to work toward preventing similar failures, that's what integrity looks like." She paused, looking out the window at the city beyond. The 3-year-old child who made that observation was more powerful than any prosecutor's argument or police detective's investigation. He simply told the truth. That's what our entire system is supposed to be about, truth, even when truth creates inconvenient complications. Officer left the judge's chambers understanding, perhaps for the first time, that his professional redemption came not from success, but from failure properly acknowledged and corrected. He had learned that justice required more than conviction, that procedure mattered more than outcome, that the system's integrity was more valuable than any single prosecution. Duke, now 9 years old and approaching retirement from active service, remained at side. The dog had witnessed the entire journey, the initial investigation's confidence, the courtroom's dramatic revelation, the case's unraveling, and finally, the transformation of failure into systemic improvement. The Carver case faded from public attention but remained embedded in law enforcement practice. It became known as the case that changed how we verify informants. It became a teaching tool, a cautionary tale, and ultimately, a story about how a small voice, even the innocent observation of a 3-year-old child, could force a system to examine its foundations and correct its course. Officer continued his work, forever changed, forever aware that the path to justice was not always the path that seemed most righteous. He had learned that sometimes, real justice meant accepting that guilty people would face reduced consequences because the system's integrity demanded it. He had learned that law enforcement existed not simply to catch criminals, but to do so in ways that preserved the constitutional protections that separated a just system from an unjust one. And he had learned that the most important truth often came not from evidence or investigation, but from an innocent child simply remembering a dog. The end.